the steering group. I am going to just do a couple of logistics, then I will ask for roll call and then offer an amendment to the agenda and ask if there's any others. The logistics is just welcome to the meeting of the steering group. One of the things that we ask participants is if you can keep your camera off just during the parts where we're discussing so that members of the steering group can see each other. It looks like I have enough squares on my screen right now and I can see everyone. So I think we're good. But if too many people have it open, it's hard for us to see each other. I'm going to call on folks in the order of where I see them. So, Anne, I'll start with you. We're just doing roll call.
I'm here.
Thanks. Craig, if you just want to say your name and.
Yep, Craig Polio here.
Thank you. And Peter, I think you're next.
Excuse me, Peter Coleman from the Vermont House.
Oh, Nicole, I wasn't sure if you, or maybe it's on my end.
Oh, you were the only one that froze for me, but hi, Nicole, nice, VSBA.
Thanks. Zoe?
Hi, good afternoon. Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education.
And Jennifer.
Afternoon, Jennifer Deck Samuelson, Vermont State Board of Education.
Great, thank you. And I'm Megan Roy. Here is the chair. I would like to propose an amendment to the agenda to the steering group. I'd like to add a brief public comment opportunity before the meeting begins in case there's folks who want to share anything beforehand. Steering group okay with that amendment? Yep, Jennifer?
Yes, I am okay with that. I was thinking, and we don't need to necessarily amend the agenda, I don't think, and I'm not sure how this group is going to sort of winnow the potential people that might be on this Ed Finance subcommittee, but I might propose that if we get to discussing specific people, it would be helpful to have an executive session.
Yes.
Since it's an agenda item to identify the criteria and the names, maybe we can talk about it in the context of that, and then if the group decides that it's an allowable executive session, I'm guessing there might be discussion on whether or not it is, but we can talk about it when we get to it on the agenda. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other amendments? Okay. Is there anyone from the public who would like to address the steering group?
Yes, yes, I would.
Jay, I think so. Right now you're the only hand, so go ahead.
Okay. I've made a very troubling discovery that I want to share with the commission. This document, you can see, it's from the 4 organizations. Those organizations being VASBO, VSA, VPA, and the Vermont School Board Association. It's dated April 15, 2020, 4.5 months ago. It's addressed to House Speaker Jill Krawinski, if I get the names pronounced right, Chair Emily Kornheiser, and members of the House Ways and Means Committee, Chair Peter Conlon, and members of the House Education Committee. Of course, Peter Conlon is a member of the commission. And it's from the Vermont School Board Association for D.S. Smith, President, Sue Kogloski, Executive Director, Vermont Superintendent Association, Amy Miner, President, Jeff Francis, Executive Director, Jeff Francis is a commission member, Vermont Principals Association, Rebecca Pillen, President, Jay Nichols, Executive Director, and Vermont Association of School Business Officials, Morgan Daybell, President. I'd like to read one of the recommendations that they make. There are several, but this is a very troubling recommendation. Streamlined process to achieve more efficient district organization and governance. The legislature should establish a responsible and well-defined process and criteria for district school boards to directly petition the governor to amend their governance structure in districts or to close schools. Post Act 46, there are opportunities to achieve more streamlined and effective governance or options-based or optimized space within public schools, but vigorous local opposition to school board plans stymies progress. School boards should be able to petition the governor and his administration to approve district mergers or school closures if they determine that doing so is a more effective and efficient use of educational resources and provide increased educational opportunities. Final decisions for a petition and statutory prescribed process would rest with the governor. This is a reprehensible attack on the people of Vermont. This is an attempt to interfere with the democratic process and their constitutional rights and replace it with a dictatorship. This is totally unacceptable, especially coming from these organizations who are charged by statute to make appointments of 4 commissioners. So it calls into question the work that the commission is embarking on, whether or not there's a hidden agenda at work. In order to look at more collaboration, I got the minutes after searching for quite some time of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials. This is dated April 12th, 2024, 3 days before the document I just shared with you. And on the committee updates, reading directly from the minutes, it states Legislative Collaborative, Morgan Daybell and Heather Bushy, Legislative Collaborative. They're making an update. They're updating the membership. There was a letter sent out in collaboration with partner organizations based on the yield bill presented. That is reference to the document that I just showed you. In addition to that, as I look at the minutes, Representative Emily Kornheiser joined the meeting in a question and answer period on 887, the yield bill. And I read the comments right from the minutes. Would like to share sentiment around the core issues of funding of curriculum and size of schools, need authority and evidence of influencing the public around school size. Without this, the potential of decreasing the quality of education given the inflation parameters within the bill. The answer by Emily was referencing Act 46 could be problematic. May need to have it be a separate thing as a whole. The Ed Committee is tasked with tasking a task force to recommend class and school sizes. This is a further confirmation that there is a hidden agenda to arrive at a predetermined outcome in this process. And I find that very objectionable, and I'm going to issue a complaint. I'm going to follow the process, especially when we look at and this come up before, that there is about 20% of the state north of Chittenden County. So I'm going to share my concerns with my Franklin County delegation, and I'm going to share with whatever legislative members, because this is totally unacceptable and it undermines the work of this commission. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jay. Seeing no other hands, we do have another opportunity at the end of the meeting. Can I have a motion to approve the draft minutes from our last steering group meeting?
I'll move.
Thanks, Jennifer. A second?
Second.
Thanks, Senator Cummings. Any discussion or edits or suggestions? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Opposed? I think I saw everyone's hands. Okay. So I'm going to move us on. I'll try to give some context, and again, offering a way for us to have the conversation. This really is the steering group's conversation. At our first meeting, there was a discussion about data and the extent to which there's some data that needs to be in the hands of the commission as it starts its work. And there was a brainstorm at the meeting, and then some steering group members sent some additional brainstorms of the types of data that we could potentially look at. And so the purpose of the conversation to kick us off is really to say, is this brainstormed list the right list of data? It is not meant to use today to review the data. It's meant to say what's necessary for us to be able to do the work and develop the work plan for the commission. Is there anything missing? What's the status of this, and to what extent does some of this data exist? And if it doesn't exist yet, how will we get it? So that's the framing that I'm offering to have the conversation. Why don't we start with the questions at the bottom, unless someone has another suggestion. But essentially, running through this list, brainstormed list, is there anything else that the steering group needs to know how to develop and propose a work plan? And secondary to that, is there other data that the commission may need to get? Nicole, I see your hand.
Thanks, Megan. I thought this was a really good starting point. I don't think it needs to be an exhaustive list of these, we'll only look at this data. I think it'll get us started and more questions will arise. But one thing I did think might be useful is to clarify that the breakdown of the education payment, and for folks not familiar with that, that's really the bill that's sent to the state for all the collective budgets that have been voted on across the state. Breaking that down by object and function, I think would be useful, not just for the current fiscal year, but for prior fiscal years, perhaps just post or pre-COVID to current, because I think that will help us see the extent to which mental health services, the breakdown by function lets us see exactly how those funds are being spent. And I expect that with the new chart of accounts, at least, that it will be easier for districts to report out to the agency if they don't already do that. But that we are supposed to be accounting for expenses the same way. And I do think that will help illuminate a lot of sort of the theories that I have heard about what's driving the increasing in costs at the local level.
Thanks, Nicole. Jennifer, and then Zoe.
Thank you. So just to confirm that we're looking at this chart that you put together that's with the data sets. Okay, just want to make sure. With regard to the first row, demographic data, I think it would be really helpful to have the breakdown by district. And also, I'm curious over what period of time, because I think it would be helpful to have not just, the current year or the past year, but maybe like a 5-year, something. And I'm not wedded to any particular amount of time, but I think it would be helpful to see, how the numbers are trending over a certain period of time, whatever time we might decide that would be. Similarly, under the governance delivery system data, the supervisory district and unions, this is the first line: number of students served, number of towns served, cost per equalized pupil. Again, I think it would be really helpful to have a time period ascribed to that. And then I think it would also be helpful, I didn't see this anywhere, to look at facility needs per district. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Zoe?
Great. Thank you for compiling this list of data points. I do think it's going to be really important for us to frame our conversation and kind of guide the decision points. So we've done some work at the agency of going through this list, and I can share where we are in terms of being able to access this data readily and report. Also, as part of the agency's broader Listen and Learn tour, we're putting together some enhanced reporting and want to share with you where we are with that and what we can expect. We're pretty close to looking at this data at a statewide level and being able to provide a report within, I think my goal is within the next 2 weeks, so certainly by the next commission meeting. And so that would look at enrollment data, and wherever possible, we're looking at either 5 or 10 years of trend data. So we look at enrollment, and then we're further refining that the enrollment from the largest school district to the smallest school district, but also creating quintiles so that we can compare similar SUs in terms of geography and size, and looking, calling out the change of enrollment. Additionally, we will have a trend for state assessment data for ELA and math, and be able to break that out by our subgroups as well. Right now, we're operating off of the 2023 year data. We'll see if we'll be able to pull in this most recent test year. Certainly, if that's not available by the end of the month, we will have that shortly in the fall. We also will be able to pull demographic trends, looking at statewide, but also looking at those quintiles, so we kind of understand the range of SUs that have kind of higher free and reduced lunch versus lower free and reduced lunch, English language learners and special education students as part of their population. We'll be able to pull together staffing ratios, looking at teacher to student ratio, leadership to student ratio, student services to student ratio, and support services to student ratio, and looking at that for the past 5 years, and be able to show some minimums and maximums as well. In terms of teacher salary, we will be able to report that at statewide averages. Right now, we do not have that by district, but that is an area we're looking to collect data so that we can have a more nuanced understanding of variation by collective bargaining agreements in different districts. In terms of spending, we will be looking at operating expenditures per pupil for the past 5 years, and also doing a breakdown of the funding source. To Nicole's point, I made a note, we probably need to, based on your request, have a little bit of a further breakdown by object and function. So I'll explore our ability to break that down further than how we've been analyzing it to date. Yeah. And additionally, we're looking to provide some comparisons as we look at mapping our school performance both by enrollment and spending compared to demographics, and also performance by some of these indicators as well on using a matrix. So we'll continue to analyze this, and hopefully that can be quite instructive to this group. I know that we'll need more data, and I heard the request also from Jennifer to have it by district, and also we've been thinking about looking at this by region. So I think that's part of a next phase of analysis after we give our statewide results, to be able to further break that down by like SUs in schools and by geographic similarities as well as need. So I'm excited that we're making progress in that, and just wanted to give the team assurance that we certainly will have, I think, a good set of data to at least begin to look at, and knowing, of course, that we're going to continue to have a need to break that down further. The second point I wanted to bring up also was collecting new data related to a survey that we'd like to push out within the next couple of weeks to the general public, and being able to get information, I think, on a lot of the questions that we're trying to understand in terms of what's really important to preserve about our education system, where there are opportunities where we're looking to make some enhancements, and getting some additional feedback around kind of how the general public kind of evaluates and values the different services that are offering in our schools, so that we can collect that data to inform further discussions and future engagement as well.
Thanks, Zoe. It's just given that little snapshot of what you've described, the the purpose of the steering group wanting to think a little bit about data at this stage is so that as we launch the commission into doing its work, particularly the work with the soonest deadline, was to ground ourselves in a common metrics, common understanding of the situation, really to help define the problem statement. That phrase was used last time. And what I'm hearing is that actually a pretty significant body of data is available to us, could potentially be presented to the commission at its next meeting. Certainly there's going to be missing pieces. That's, I think to a large extent, that's fine. I think the goal is to have some important information so that some conversations can be grounded in that data before they start. Is there anything, and I don't know if this is for you specifically, Zoe, or anything for the steering group, anything on this list that we're not sure if we would have at our disposal beforehand? And if not, is it critical to have before we set the group on its path to doing the work? Because again, our goal isn't here to review it. Our goal is to say, where would we find it? And how do we set that into motion? So is there anything on here that maybe isn't necessarily covered? Nicole, go ahead.
Well, I know it's covered. I'm just not sure it's covered by the Agency of Education. So what I had not heard from Zoe's report was the ed fund uses and sources over time. And I do think that that is a really important piece of information, particularly for the finance conversation. But I think that the full commission would benefit from it as well. And I think typically that has been analysis or information tracked by the Joint Fiscal Office. So I wouldn't expect that the agency would have it, but just wanted to throw that out there for discussion around how those pieces might be pulled together.
Peter.
Excuse me, thank you. So I did talk to the Joint Fiscal Office analyst who does most of this work. And what she said is, in fact, she just takes data from the AOE that already exists and puts it into, an easy to understand way of doing it. So really, a lot of this information has been presented repeatedly to the legislature. Much of it is easily accessible. And depending on how we choose to go forward, and I would say, I'm talking about financial information, not student outcome data, that sort of thing, but ed fund uses, even such things as just, breakdown of how many districts we have, how many schools we have, that sort of thing. But to sort of ground ourselves in those key issues, it might be beneficial for the commission at the next meeting to have Nicole Lee from AOE and Julia Richter from Joint Fiscal Office come in. They've sort of done this show many, many times, assuming that the commission feels it even needs it. They've all heard it many times as well. But if we want to sort of say, okay, we're all in agreement on this base level of information, that would be one place to start. Julia Richter at JFO told me she'd be more than willing to come in and join Nicole Lee from AOE in presenting this.
Zoe.
Thank you for mentioning those team members, and they're really valuable, and I think could share a lot and really provide an kind of a general information and a baseline of understanding of the education fund. Craig and I have talked about, between our two organizations, doing an information series, and I think that's exactly the content, is really breaking down the ed uses and sources. So that's something we can add to our list. Would you be interested in including that for the next commission meeting, or would that be after we review kind of the high level data, or together?
I view that maybe not a deep dive and sort of slicing and dicing, but I do think trends in terms of sources and uses in the ed fund is the type of high level data that would be useful for the full commission as part of the grounding and data presentation.
Okay, thank you. I've added it to our list.
So it
Which
sounds
I know will
like
continue to grow this list.
it sounds like for the next commission meeting, a pretty substantial data dive. Again, not every single way of looking at it, but it sounds like a presentation of a good portion, if not all, of these preliminary data sets is something that we can reasonably count on. Okay.
Yes.
So given that, does the steering group want to have any more of a data conversation today before deciding how to approach the work? Because that's actually our deliverable for today, is develop how are we as a commission and how are you as a steering group proposing a work plan to the commission. So is there anything else kind of related to data that you feel like you need to talk through in order to help you develop a work plan? Not seeing hands, so I think that we may be ready to move on.
Is this just with regard to the Ed Finance Subcommittee? Is this I mean, I want to make sure that we're narrowing our discussion at this point about developing a work plan with regard to the Ed Finance.
No, this is the agenda item is work plan development for the commission, because in order for you as a group to propose something to the full commission and then have the commission adopt that full work plan, that's not to say that work plans can't change, they certainly can, but the law has the commission adopting a work plan by September 15th. So they need to see your draft by their next meeting. That was the timeline that we had talked about last time. So this part of the discussion is work plan for the commission. In my head, I've been thinking about that as how the commission will approach its work. It's not necessarily a calendar of exactly every piece of it, but how are they approaching their work? You will need to leave today's meeting with something to propose back to the commission. Does that answer that part of the question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. And then, yes, we have a separate but also deliverable conversation today around the makeup of the finance committee because of that timeline. Zoe.
So I shared some of the quantitative data that we're pulling together, and I just wanted to bring out to the value of bringing in qualitative data from the public and as part of our broader engagement efforts. And in an effort, as part of, I know, our guiding principles is to build on existing work. I just wanted to share again that the agency will be providing a survey and inviting people to provide input on our education system. And so as we're finalizing that in the next week and a half, I just wanted to open up this opportunity to ask the steering members if there are specific information or perception data that you think would be important and valuable to capture at this point to help guide the work of the steering committee and commission.
I loved your framing, Zoe, originally around what is it that people value about our education system. And so having not seen the questions, I do think we hear a lot about what folks don't want us to do or don't want the outcome of this process to be. And if there's some way to solicit folks thinking around what changes could we, to be thinking of it as in a positive way, an evolution of our education system. I don't know how to word the question, but I do think not only capturing what folks value, but also what sort of positive changes or risks we'd be willing to take in order to preserve sort of the fundamental strength of the public education system. So I appreciate the positive frame, because I think it's too easy for folks to get into what they don't want. And we really need to be talking about what we do want.
Anne.
Yeah. I think what we need to do is strike a balance. I mean, the reason we're here, at least according to my emails, is that the cost of the education system has become unbearable for a much larger group of people. At least that's what they tell me. And so if we just talk about what would be the best education and don't balance it with what realistically, how much money can we realistically raise? What is our tax base? And, you know, we can, that's fairly finite right now. And I think we need to get that kind of financial data to know that's one of the tools, what we have to work with as we design the system so that we come out with a balance and not just a kind of a dreamscape of if I could design the perfect system, this is what it would look like.
So kind of helping to get input on the parameters.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a feeling Commissioner Bolio could help us with that.
Always happy to help. Again, I think a lot of the info that JFO puts out as well on sources will help illuminate that, and my team is happy to help be a part of that conversation. I agree, Anne, that that's an important part of this, so happy to help support how I can and how my team can.
Thanks. Peter?
Thanks. I hope we don't get too bogged down in right now about what data and how much of each kind of data we necessarily need. I think as we sort of start diving into it, we'll have a better idea of what we want. And I think really it's the subcommittees under each sort of task that will probably even more clearly define how much of and what kind of data we want. So I just, rather than trying to compile it all for the next commission meeting, we'll need to pick and choose to give that general overview that keeps us all sort of grounded in the basic framework of our system.
Great. With that, anything else on data before we shift to how you will recommend that the commission start its work? Okay. So as I shared in the materials, this draft work plan is really just that. It's meant as a starting point to frame our conversation. It feels important for me to start with affirming that those are the bodies of work, and then move from there to what is the best way for the commission to address that. So if we want to start with, I'll give just a little bit of framing because I pulled from our conversations the three things, the three buckets, for lack of a better word, about the work is obviously recommendations around the education finance system, recommendations around governance, resources, and administration, and recommendations around the education delivery system. And then my I guess recommendation is that we also see the communication and engagement as a body of work itself that obviously spans all of those things, but there's some pretty specific charges in the law that asks this commission to do that in a really thoughtful way. And some of the feedback and engagement we've gotten so far is really seeking that. So that's the context behind the 4. Is that the right 4? How about the steering group start with that conversation? Is that the right way to carve up the work?
I think it's interesting that you said carve up, right? So to me, there's so much overlap between some of the, I think they're the right buckets of, the scope and the charge is so broad. So I'm appreciative of the trying to group things together in like categories. And I think you've done a great job of that. Those make sense to me. And I wonder at what point there's sort of cross pollination that will happen across these different strands. If you've given any thought to that, or what others think about that.
Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Okay, I think they're the right buckets, but cross-pollination, at some point, it's probably going to be the steering committee. I can see the finance system and the delivery system needing to talk together periodically, because if they're going in absolutely different directions, we're going to have a problem. So there's going to need to be communication so that everyone knows what everyone else is thinking. And if we have a diversion, going in radically different directions, then we're going to need to work it out.
Yeah, go ahead, Zoe.
What we might consider is appointing a member of the steering committee to sit on each of the committees, and then having a standing item at our steering committee to report out what was discussed and the main priorities.
I just, while we're talking about sort of process and communication and all that, we've all sort of served on large boards and commissions. Might be worth sort of doing a quick roundtable as to what, or people should chime in what they think is the best. I was sort of foreseeing us essentially having 2 meetings a month, where one is the full commission and then the other is committees meeting. And at the full commission meeting is a time to sort of do that cross-pollination, talk about what's going on in each one. Where the steering committee fits into all that, I'm not quite sure. Maybe we'll have run our course at that point, I don't know, and we're on an ad hoc basis. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents, and many of you have served on and continue to serve on big, complicated boards that could chime in as well.
Thanks, Peter. In some ways, that's exactly the next part of that conversation, is depending on how you propose that the work is, kind of the legwork behind the work is done, because ultimately it is the full commission who's going to be the body that makes the recommendations, but the behind the scenes work. I think both of those structures could be a way to keep the work connected. And I think, Nicole, your overarching point is one we can't lose sight of, because frankly, the weight of the charge of this commission is because there's a recognition that you can't disentangle any of those things, and they can't be done in isolation. So it's a really important point that we don't create silos in how we break the work down, and yet at the same time, some sort of way of saying this is at least how we're going to organize ourselves is helpful. Yep, Nicole.
Yeah, just to sort of respond to Peter's question, I do think the steering committee could play a really important role in assuring that agendas seem a lot. So if, as Zoe suggested, we each take, or more than one of us potentially is on a given committee, that we really help to remind folks. I think that charge that you put down is really important, but how do we support the development of agendas that align the work effectively? So I don't see us putting ourselves out of business, unfortunately, Peter. Like when we had, the SBA board, I think it was 23 members. We had an executive committee that really worked with me to say, okay, how do we plan out our agendas so that we're making progress on work and we're not, and that committees are aligned in terms of the work that's happening. So I think that the strategy of having each of us sort of serve on those committees makes sense, and that we can use this space to really, more than update align the work and ensure that, you know, if two groups need to get together and have a meeting, that can happen. Just to give some structure to it.
I, as the person who by default suggests the agendas, I would very much appreciate that structure so that I don't do that in isolation. That's going to be staying the same. I am going to also throw out there, since my internet just glitched, my Wi-Fi is a little glitchy. You all can continue going through your conversation. You have the agenda. If I drop off, I will drop back on. So apologies in advance, but I just noticed it did it again. Okay. I do wonder if it might help to go through each one because we've carved them up. I know I've used the word and several of us have used the word subcommittee attached to each one, but let's confirm that that's really what we mean. It could be that something is identified as its own body of work and it may or may not lend itself to a subcommittee. I'll start with communication and engagement. Again, that one, for me, being the one right now who's getting most of the input from the public, people really want to know how they're going to be able to engage in this process. And I think the faster that we can be open about here's the plan for engagement, there's specific groups and individuals that we are tasked with engaging, and then there's just the broader issue of engagement. And so my thought is that whether this is delegated to a couple of people or a full subcommittee, the role of the subcommittee is really just to develop a plan of engagement, so to speak, and just sort of shepherd it through and keep making sure that it's happening. We've had lots of conversations about acknowledging that there's engagement work happening and we should capitalize on engagement work already happening. Largely what Zoe's described in terms of the Listen and Learn tour, but there's other events, there's other things that we can capitalize on. So if this were delegated, that group could keep tabs on those things. So what does the steering group think about communication and engagement and how to address that? Is that a subcommittee or is that a few people? I think Nicole.
Thanks. I just wanted to reiterate how important I think this is. And I don't think it's important in the context of informing folks on what the commission's up to and how to weigh in on our conversations. But as I've been thinking about this, the problem statement that Senator Cummings laid out is not a new problem statement, right? The costs of our K-12 system in the context of declining enrollment has been happening in the state as long as I've been part of the public policy scene. And we are where we are because the answers to that problem are very hard and become very political. And in the absence of broad groups of Vermonters understanding the underlying data and the underlying factors and the options that we have can really address those, I don't see how the dynamic changes around this conversation. So when I think about, you know, consultant funds that have been given to this commission, to me, that is an opportunity that none of us, you know, I think I'm appreciative, Zoe, of the work that you are doing on a survey, but I think it's likely to be the usual folks that want to weigh in and who pay attention to this stuff. I do think we need some more creative strategies to engage more Vermonters in these really hard choices that we're going to have to make. So I just wanted to state how important I think this is, whether it's a committee or a couple people working with somebody who has expertise in this area. That would be something I would advocate for. Oops.
Thanks, Nicole. Zoe, and then Anne.
Yeah, I agree that this part is of critical importance to the work. So having spent a couple of months trying to think through how we do approach a listen and learn tour, I can share that there is tremendous complexity to engaging this work and doing it in an authentic way that does think outside the box and try to get more people engaged. So I do think there needs to be a very concerted effort on this. I also think we should have intentionality on building on what's in place. So there are a number of convenings that are happening through different associations. We've shared some of what the agency's doing. There's different trainings that are available. I think all of those are opportunities that we need to take advantage of and pull into the larger plan. And then think about how, as we go forward in this work, we're really engaging in smaller, localized, grassroots conversations that can really are where we're collecting informed input. And so I share that because I think it's very important for us to take a phased approach where, you know, we're ensuring that everyone's has an understanding of the current state. And that we're breaking that down and giving opportunity to have engagement and questions so that there's you know, a kind of a shared understanding and then getting input around those priorities. So I think it is helpful definitely to have some focused work on this and knowing how much time it takes to put in place and to do the scheduling and how our timeline is very short. I would want us to just be really intentional about trying to capitalize on all of the opportunities that are already planned to the extent possible.
Thanks, Zoe. Anne and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I think I was having some of the same thoughts. I mean, I've done a fair share of public meetings. You usually get at least one, sometimes two interest groups, frequently on different sides of the issue. And you sit there and you listen, and there's no actual communication of data, you know, and it finish up and you know what people's opinions are, but they don't necessarily mesh with what you've got to work with. So I think the challenge is, how do we set up a more focused actual communications with people where, and I think the bill, sure it does, requires us to have meetings in 13 in all the counties. I think it's silent on whether or not our bodies have to be present or we can Zoom that. But that's a tremendous amount of logistics. Just if we have to get ourselves and set up a meeting and publicize it in every county, that's going to take a tremendous amount of work and could distract from our ability to craft these meetings so that they are constructive, so that there's actual communication that happens there two-way. I think that's important.
I really agree about the two-way conversation. You know, not a traditional type of a town hall forum, but really being able to facilitate a discussion, I think is going to be critical.
Thanks. Jennifer?
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like there's an awful lot that's going into this communication bucket and engagement. So, I mean, for instance, the commission is required to collaborate and seek information from, you know, multiple 10 different organizations, in addition to soliciting input from the public. And I mean, just to kind of echo what I've heard other people say, I agree that this sort of needs to be an organic process where, you know, phase one, we're collecting information to be able to synthesize it, analyze it, see if there are, you know, threads that we can pick out and sort of, you know, pull on. And then the later phase is going to be, you know, effectively communicating back to the public what are we doing and why are we doing it? And, really seeking to get that community buy-in, because whatever we're doing, we want this to succeed, not just at the commission level, but we want it to succeed statewide. So I think this communication to me feels really, really important. And it does strike me, and I think, Nicole, maybe you'd mentioned this could be something that a consultant could really help with, to help facilitate those conversations, and then, really work on helping us to communicate back. So I would definitely, think that would be helpful. And it's possible too that we might be able to qualify for grants as we're embarking on some of this work. And maybe that's something too that a consultant might be able to help us with, so that we have additional sources of funding to help us do this work.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'm hearing a couple of different things. I'm hearing the desire to, the piece that's sticking out for me is the engaging and getting feedback, but grounded in a common set of facts. And I think that both things have to happen together, even though then subsequent engagement will be iterative and responsive, and it will be change and be organic. But I also think that baked in we want to hear from you is, here is the current reality. And I wonder even about a more palatable and understandable version of the data dive that the commission is going to get. So I'm hearing things like that. I'm hearing identifying existing opportunities to do just that, so that there is a roadshow that can be replicated at multiple things that are already happening. We've already acknowledged that we're going to benefit from the data gathered at the Listen and Learn endeavor. Even though that's a separate thing, it is very much information that this commission will need. What I don't hear yet is, if the idea is that a subcommittee will draft the plan, even though the plan can change, but they will draft a plan that says, here's the messages, here's the different types of engagement, here's the type of engagement that we're going to do during our meetings that rotate around, here's the type of engagement we're going to do with named groups individually, here's the type of communication that lends itself to focus groups. Like, I don't need to define it. I think the committee would define it. But to me, that's what we need. It isn't necessarily that this committee does it, but this committee puts the framework around it and then makes sure it's happening. And then, yes, it will change and update. Peter.
Just to say yes to everything you just said. I like the way you put it. And I would say this, like everybody else has said, this is the probably one area where I do feel strongly that outside consulting help would be important. And especially somebody to coordinate among, what's going on with the Agency of Education with their work. But yeah, to everything you just said, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, that is several of you have mentioned that, and I would agree. It's really hard to do that work well if you're not an expert in that work. And I don't know, Zoe, this is whenever we touch on the concept of a consultant, we're going to also touch on logistics and how do we make that happen. And it's rarely as fast as we want. What I don't know is what currently exists or partnerships that exist with the agency, and whether or not there's room to capitalize on that, which I might be getting ahead of that conversation a little bit, but I didn't even really ask you a question, but I did point at you.
I think there's kind of two parts of I think the question is, one, are there opportunities to leverage existing partnerships that the agency may have or any other group might have right now? And then how do we craft a scope of work for a consultant to really drive the unique charge of the commission? So I'll start with the first part of that question. The agency, we do have a consultant working with us on the Listen and Learn who is helping us to develop the data reports and also engage in this facilitated conversation. The first part of that is to really engage with our education leaders in the field by region to make sure that we're understanding kind of the localized priorities and nuances of the schools in specific regions. So I think there's a tie-in there for the steering committee and commission to be kind of learning from that work as well. And then the listen and learn would be later, more in October, where we're looking to have more of those, two-way conversations within the community. Some of that is related directly to the agency's function, but I'm very interested in ensuring that that work is supportive and aligned to this group. So I think there's a very natural bridge there in making sure that we're facilitating those conversations in a way that's advancing this work while we are, going out to bid for a consultant to drive the next phase of planning. So I think, so getting back to that, number one, I'm a very willing and interested partner in working with this group to ensure that the work we're doing in partnership with a consultant is also supportive. And that includes the survey, that includes these data reports and the listen and learns that we'll be doing in October. For the next part, I would encourage us, in the next part, meaning the consultant specific to the commission's charge, I would encourage us to get very concrete as quickly as we can on that scope of work, because as Megan, you mentioned, it does take time to go through that process, the procurement process of bringing someone on board. And think about, really think, if we start that work in kind of an October timeframe, right? Like, where do we anticipate we'll be in our planning based on what we can leverage today, with existing partnerships, and think through, what does that two-way communication look like? Something else that I've seen work really well, which would be interesting, is creating kind of a meeting in the box, right? Which is this idea that we can't be everywhere at all times, but we might be able to create a toolkit where we encourage every group who may have a meeting to take 15 to 20 minutes at the top of their meeting and walk through some of the data, provide input, and have a mechanism to get that back to us, in addition to those on-the-ground conversations that would be facilitated. So I think there's a lot of creative ways that we can bring in that, frankly, we would need some additional expertise and support to map that out in a way that's going to help us collect data in a streamlined fashion, and also engage in more of that grassroots on the ground work that I think is what we're all really intending to do, so that we're getting a diversity of perspectives and we're engaging those folks that may not have been engaged previously in this conversation. So all that to say, yes, we can leverage what we have now. And two, as your partner in getting the procurement process through, I would just encourage us to spend time finalizing that scope of work.
Great, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for creating a question out of my commentary. And is your hand still up, or is that an old
No.
hand? Okay.
No,
Nicole.
see if I can get it down.
So this body of work that we're undertaking is an 18-month-long project. So I'm really, the way I'm thinking about it is, I think the work that you're doing, Zoe, which really is going to be, I think, my understanding is rooted in the school communities themselves and the educational leaders. And the data work we're starting to embark on, it feels a little early to then launch a big community, right? I think we have some time. We can give ourselves until the spring to really get a little bit clearer about what is the fundamental, information that we want to set the table with, and what is it that we're looking for from folks in terms of input, and what can we offer them in terms of, you got a menu of options here. Let's talk about the pros and cons of each. So I think forming a committee, having that committee be connected to the work that's happening out of the agency. So potentially being able to attend listen and learn sessions, just to potentially review the survey questions, just to ensure, understanding, alignment, and then begin to work on a scope of work for conversations that could launch in the spring, or, I don't care what the timeline, but I think for me, we need to give ourselves some time to get ready to go beyond the education community, Education community, I think, is pretty fluent in this conversation. And it's once we start to go beyond that, we need to give ourselves some time and to work with a professional who can help us distill our jargon into terms that are meaningful to folks. So I like the idea of sort of scaffolding the engagement by building off the work that the agency's doing this fall and having a committee sort of guide that. And I think, the community engagement plan can be pretty broad in that sense, right? That's due next month. It can be just that basic.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So I'm hearing agreement that this is a body of work. They will largely frame and define what the short and long-term work is. I think some quick wins can be made by this group to identify the things that are already happening and figuring out a way for us to stay connected to those. I think that makes a lot of sense. This is going to raise a question that is relevant for most of these bodies of work, which is how does the steering group want to populate these committees? The finance committee is different. You are tasked in a law with, so we're going to come back to that. But in terms of who's on the communication committee, if governance, resources, and administration and delivery system remain subcommittees, your group is going to need to talk about how do you want those appointed? Is it by volunteer? Is it by proposing the work plan back to the commission and saying, here's the available work, what interests you? Or is it a little bit more strategic than that? It can be both. So that I don't know that we answer that now or if we answer that at the end of this work plan conversation, but that's something you're going to have to decide. And we are not an enormous commission. So even having 4 groups, one at least is carved out and might have some outside membership, but the rest has to be members of the committee. So we just need to keep that in mind. Okay. I'm going to move us on to work plan. So I don't know that there's any debate about the education finance system being a subcommittee because that's required in the law. And that has its own timeline attached to it, at least as it pertains to the preliminary recommendations. We have a discussion item on that later in today's agenda, so I'm going to skip over that one. It's a little more concrete. But let's kind of have the same discussion about governance, resources, and administration. If we agree, so this is the piece of the legislation that asks the commission to propose recommendations about the structure and capacity of the agency. That includes department versus agency structure, and then role, function, appointment of state board members. So hence the putting them together under governance, resources, and administration. So is this a subcommittee, or is this work that should be tackled differently? I should also have started out the conversation. The steering group can decide that these things are full commission bodies of work, and then we just plan an agenda ahead of time. I don't mean to channel us to subcommittee. If something is significant enough that all 13 people should be engaged in it, that's for you to decide. Jennifer, I see your hand.
Thank you. So because this does implicate the board, I want to just kind of maybe let the steering committee know what the board has been doing and where I think the board could be going, because it is relevant to this. So we've had a roles and responsibilities subcommittee that has been stood up for a couple of years. And just in full transparency, it kind of went on hiatus when Dan French stepped down, and we were waiting to have a new secretary to continue the work because it felt like it was important work to be doing in consultation with the agency and a secretary of education. So that work started. It's been on hiatus for a while. I think we now have Zoe in as an interim secretary, but I'm also hearing, loud and clear from the legislature that this is important work that needs to be happening now. So recognizing that, I am reconvening this roles and responsibilities subcommittee to start looking with the agency into this work and picking up where we'd left off about a year and a half ago. I believe, Zoe, that you and I and Tammy are meeting in the next day or so on this issue. So the agency and the board are talking about these things. And I think what might make sense is to let us do what I think that meeting's been in the book since April, maybe, because just the summer's always hard to get together. But I might suggest that this doesn't need to be a subcommittee meeting, that this might be something that the state board and the agency can work on, and we can report back to the commission on the work that we're doing. Because I think if we can figure out how we best support each other, that would be helpful. And I guess the other piece of information I should throw in here is that we are having our next State Board of Ed meeting is going to be August 21st, and we are having an extended working session where one of the topics for discussion will be what are the strengths of the agency, what are the strengths of the board, and how can we leverage each other's strengths to really support the work that we're doing. So I will pause there.
Thanks, Jennifer. That update is helpful. Nicole.
Yeah, that is helpful. I had sort of wanted to talk about what else would fall under this category, because I don't see it necessarily captured elsewhere. And that is, I think, part of the charge is to talk about sort of this sort of state control versus local control dynamic and sort of what sits where. And so I'm wondering whether that's another component of the charge. And while I appreciate the need to avoid proliferation of committees, I also think folks from the field may have a lot of useful input in terms of current perceptions of the role of the agency and the state board and what works well, what doesn't work well. So I would think that this committee would be, I think, state board's going to continue to do its work with the agency. That's important. But I think a committee structure, and especially if there's the added layer of, I don't know where resources comes in the title, but to me, it's like governance and administration, and sort of in the state, we have this structure of the state board, agency of education, local school boards. And I think this could be a conversation around not just how the agency and state board work, but how local folks feel about that. And also that piece around what that is part of the charge, I think, is to talk through what should sit, which decisions should sit where.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nicole. I would just add, I think that the body of work that the state board might be engaged in is not different from the fact that the agency is engaged in some work that involves engaging the public, and it's really important work for them and we might benefit from it. It's also not necessarily totally our work. So we will benefit from that state board conversation, but I would agree. And I think, Nicole, the add of just decision makers from a policy standpoint is important. Zoe, and then Peter.
I appreciate the conversation around kind of broadening this and thinking about our entire education ecosystem. I think that's really critical as we first identify the roles and responsibilities and how we're going to most effectively advance the education goals for our state. I think the work that the agency is doing with the State Board of Education is quite also helpful in that work and really leveraging the unique expertise that we both bring to this. But I do think that broader conversation around state and local roles and responsibilities is very valuable, and really making sure that form follows function. How do we need to be structured in a way to best support the educational priorities and to help uplift the field to reach our goals for educational equity statewide. So I appreciate that conversation. I'm wondering if there's a timing component of it in terms of, it seems like obviously education finance is needing to be established first for that committee. And I think communication is definitely elevating to a very high level to begin that work. This may be able to wait just a couple months until the agency has had an opportunity to really refine our strategic plan, get some initial feedback from the field that we're doing through the regional planning, and also engaging with the state board to allow that to help inform the conversation. But I do welcome that, and I think it's important that we have that in a holistic, comprehensive discussion so that we're all rowing in the same direction and figuring out how everyone in this space is adding value to ultimately our students, and that being our focus.
Thanks, Zoe. You just put an idea in the room that also might make our committee structure more manageable, which is staggered committees, so that they're not necessarily all happening at the same time. We still have to figure out how you connect the work if we take that approach, but that is, we should come back to that. Peter.
Thanks. I was just pulling back up Act 183. And I think that some of the suggestions that Nicole brought in are definitely included in the act, and especially discussion about state control versus local control. And as we go to sort of make these committee descriptions, I think that definitely, it's not really in there in the document that we have, but it should be in there. And you can pull it right out of the act if that helps.
Great, thank you. Craig.
And on that question too, I think there's a lot of overlap with the education finance structure conversation. So just figuring out which of those I mean, if you start with education finance, that question of the local control is likely going to come up there. And so you might have a catalyst to further that conversation if other committees come later, but I don't know, sort of thinking out loud, but I see that being a question in multiple places.
And as you use that as an example, I can see the exact same thing happening when it comes to delivery system also. So points well taken. We've all sort of just acknowledged that's part of the complexity of this work. Zoe, I think I saw your hand, but maybe not.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with that. I think that's going to be a common thread. And I think we just note that as such and ensure that as we're doing that work, that there's attention to that from each of these committees' perspectives. And then as we continue to move forward with this work, we might find some other common themes that we want to make sure we're threading across the committee's work as well.
Great. Does this body of work also lend itself to a subcommittee? I mean, I guess we've been sort of talking as if that's what the steering group is feeling. I just don't want to make that assumption.
Yeah.
Okay. Jennifer, and then Zoe.
Yeah, having sort of sat in on this conversation that we're having, I think there would be room for there to be work done by a subcommittee, but to echo Zoe's point about maybe giving this a few months to allow the agency and the state board to work on the work that is already in play might be helpful, because it could streamline the work that the subcommittee is ultimately tasked to do, or at least we stagger the work that's being done within the committee just so that we're not bumping into each other and maybe working at cross purposes. So if there is a subcommittee, maybe the subcommittee is just focused on the state versus local control issue, and maybe bring in the agency and the state board later down the road.
Thanks. Zoe, or I don't know if your hand was up from before.
Anne has her hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Anne. Thanks.
It's come up a couple times. Jay today in his testimony at the beginning talked about violating people's constitutional rights if we change the local control system. As a foundation, it might be helpful to get, what is the legal foundation of this entire system, so we know if we do have legal constraints that we have to work around, or if we can, and what they are. And it might also be helpful to know, I understand, I'm not on the education committees, that there are national standards for excellence kinds of things. And it might also be helpful to know what are some of the national standards and uh, and models that other states use. Um, so maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Maybe we just jerry rig what somebody else does. But that might be part of that just foundational information to have out there.
Thanks, Anne. Nicole.
Thanks, Ann. I totally agree. And I've mentioned this before. I think it's both the legal framework around roles and responsibilities and who's ultimately responsible for education delivery in the state, but also the funding. So body of case law that has developed. So I don't know whether that's a collaboration between the agency's legal team and the Ledge Council. I know at some point back in the days, Donna Russo Savage did a really comprehensive memo on Brigham and and the constant, there's to your point, there's no need to recreate the wheel, but I do think that's in addition to the data, getting speaking common language in terms of what rights people have or what are the clear parameters for this discussion sooner rather than later. Yeah, it's really important.
Great. And maybe again, the first layer of work for any one of these is articulating almost mini plans within the work plan. So that is really, that kind of research would be really important, and there might be other things, and that's part of what, if it is a committee, that is what that committee could do initially before starting it, and that allows some background work to be done, and still letting other things that are already going on happen. Okay, anything else on the governance piece? So I definitely heard updating again, these are just loose charges, so updating that to include the state versus local control in general. I should also just say, I would imagine that once these committees convene, they will confirm their charge and affirm that back to you all as a steering group to make sure they understood, right? So I think there's room for updating those. Education delivery system. This is arguably a very big bucket, my words. There's a lot in here. It's a good thing this is an 18-month committee for purposes of this. Not that we won't pull threads in all of the other work, but there's a lot here, and there's actually more than just what's pulled, and each of these things is pretty big. So it is the one that I would just offer, it might be worth the group's conversation. It could be a subcommittee. It could actually also be a parallel or culminating conversation that the full commission has as it's gathering information from all of this. And it also could be both. I mean, it could be a committee structure that puts things back to the full commission more often. But this one is big. So those are my observations. Nicole.
I like Zoe's form follows function reference. So part of, yeah, and I'm sort of cognizant of it's not a large commission, and people will have a very strong interest in participating in the delivery system conversation. And I fear that if that's happening at a subcommittee level, folks, won't want to be on the other, right? It'll be sort of like, well, I can't be on whatever because I need to be part of this. So I guess I hadn't thought, Megan, before about that being sort of a lot of what the commission talks about, but I do, I could be persuaded that that might be the right structural approach to take given the level of interest and how, all those pieces fit together. So you could have a couple committees where people are digging in deep to roles and responsibilities and finance and, hearing and processing feedback from the community, and that could inform the broader commission conversation around what does it mean? What does our delivery system need to look like?
Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm wondering, what if the steering committee is the subcommittee for this education delivery system? Because we can be gathering the information as it's coming in from the other subcommittees and deliberate it in the first instance, and then turn that to the full commission for a larger conversation.
I would just say I like that brainstorm. The note I was taking as Nicole was talking is leaning into the steering group as agenda planning mechanism, so that if we are to have these deep conversations, that again, I wouldn't be planning that in a vacuum, but your suggestion takes that a little bit further, so that it isn't just agenda planning, it's connecting the dots. I will let the group talk that through, but that makes a lot of sense to me. Zoe.
I think that makes sense. And the other idea I would offer is in this description of education delivery, I think we're identifying a couple other common themes that really may need to be thread across the other committees, particularly as you're looking at governance and we started talking about state and local responsibility. I think there's also an opportunity to think about the different types of programs we offer in different types of schools as part of that overarching governance model. Would be something we may want to explicitly call out. And we might just want to look at, are there some other kind of key themes that are coming out in this description that also, would be important to consider for education, finance, and communication and engagement.
Thanks, Zoe. Anne?
Yeah, I'm wondering, are we limited to just, I think it's 14 members on the commission, to these committees? Because I think there's language about in consultation with. So is it possible that we could add other people, with expertise to the subcommittees? And I'm going to look at Representative Conlon because I think his committee drafted this. So what was
I think basically the answer is no.
No.
Only the Education Finance Committee can have members that are outside the commission. Of course, it doesn't limit any subcommittee or the commission itself from bringing in and listening to anybody they would like.
Okay.
So a question I would have is, how do we want to, well, let me phrase it this way. What it's feeling like to me is that what the steering group is proposing back as a draft is potentially a way of the work plan is a recommendation for how to tackle the work. And so what we have is two pretty definitive and immediately launched subcommittees. One is the communication and engagement, and one is the finance, which again, we are going to come back to. The other two might have a committee structure, or let's actually take them one at a time. Governance, resources, and administration will have a committee structure that firms up the charge, perhaps outlines some research, but probably doesn't really get rolling for a while. The ed delivery system is a body of work that runs parallel, and I didn't hear any objection to the idea of steering that subcommittee. So I guess what I'm saying is a articulate version of that what we are proposing to the commission? And maybe we do this in two drafts if we have a touch point today to confirm our August meeting with the commission, which would be their first chance to see and give feedback on this draft. I think it would be difficult to show a work plan that has 18 months mapped out, because I actually think each of those committees will create their own map. But that's my observation. I don't know what you folks think and what you would like to have prepared to show the full commission.
Yeah, I would agree. We can't map out 18 months. It'd probably be more like along the first 5 months or whatever, where we are sort of setting up subcommittees, giving them their charge, and sort of moving forward with sort of dates and times. And then maybe each committee will need to sort of create its own work plan that is added onto it. Going back to our previous discussion about sort of education delivery and the steering committee steering that conversation for the fuller commission. And maybe we don't want to get into this right now, but I find myself always struggling over the comment of form, follow, function. And so, I start to wonder, well, maybe we should be talking about what is our vision for what we do want, and then how we get there. Or do we take what we have and just sort of try to bend it and manipulate it into something that fits the goal of equity for all at a cost Vermonters can afford? I'm stuck on that. I'm not quite sure how to get there, but I'm throwing it out there for thought.
Anne, are you raising? Yep.
Yeah, I took it down, put it back up. And I'll take it down again. I think it's going to be important that we make sure that the delivery system and the finance system are going in the same direction. That because that you're financing a system, and if you change the system, the finances need to work with whatever the system is. You might have new distribution areas. I don't know. And then the other thing, Peter just said equity. Equity is in this bill numerous times, but we haven't talked about it in relation to any of these committees. But my understanding is we do have a concern about the equity that, that all children may have access to the same educational opportunities. I know when I chaired finance, we were told we might just get sued over that, because richer towns can vote richer budgets easier than poor towns. And we haven't talked about the word equity, and I'm just wondering where that fits in. Is it the delivery system? Is it resources? Is it finance?
Jennifer and then Zoe.
I think that's a really, really important question. And I think I think it would be a fruitful conversation. I'm not sure what the outcome would be, because my deep suspicion is that equity means different things to different people, because it depends on how you're defining that. I mean, are we talking about courses that are offered? Are we talking about, how long it takes to get to school? Are we talking about classroom size? I mean, there's so many different ways to slice that up. And I think that really is the nut of the problem for me. So I don't have an answer. I wanted to echo that I think that's a really, really important question to be asking.
Thanks, Jennifer. Zoe?
I was over here mapping out kind of big buckets for the work plan that I'll just share for consideration. So it seems like the first phase is really what I would call direction setting. And under that would be an analysis of the current state of Vermont's education system, establishing a shared vision, that I think Representative Collin kind of put into some succinct words there. And then defining our terms. What do we mean by defining equity? How are we operationalizing that? Then I would say the second bucket of work would be establishing those subcommittees. And within that body of work would be, studying best practices, engaging experts, beginning to identify strategies and considerations. Then the third would be public engagement, where now we've had time to frame up the conversation, I think to Nicole's point, right? Where now we're really having a way to provide very focused opportunities for input. And then the next phase would be reflection and synthesis of all of the data collected. And the final phase would be, something around policy considerations and recommendations. So those were kind of 1, 2, 3, 5 kind of big buckets that we might establish that will help us get to this 18-month timeline. And at this point, just mapping out at least kind of the months in which those would operate, allowing the subcommittees, once they engage their work, to have more focused project plans that will get us a little bit more finite in how we'll deliver the work.
Nicole.
I just want to clarify, I'm understanding. When you say buckets, I was thinking phases, right? So we're sequencing the work, but because I was thinking of the other chart we were looking at as our bucket of work. So
Sorry, that's where to define our terms.
Yeah, yeah. But I totally agree. I think it's part of the setting the foundation. To Jennifer's point about what do we mean when we say equity, I do think having a common understanding of that term is really important, among other things. So I like, if what you're saying is phasing out the work, I agree with those 5 phases. That makes sense to me. And then the body, and I do think this is a conversation we should have with the full commission around the education delivery system. And what I don't want to have happen is folks feel like, why am I on this commission? All this work is happening in these other, and so I think that's one that's right to get some input on before we make a decision about who owns that piece of who owns that bucket.
And you're right, phases is what I was going for. So
okay, good. We're on the same page then.
Yes, we're on the same page. And I don't know if we have our chat enabled or not, but I did take notes and I could share kind of what I was thinking of in terms of those phases, but they may not be exactly the right phases. And I think to Nicole's point, like we do want the commission to weigh in on that and really say, is that the right scope of work? Did we miss another step, right, that needs to be implemented before the next phase, can be impactful?
Well, towards that end, I really like how you like merged that actually would be a little bit more of a understandable work plan type thing instead of just how to organize the work. And so I wonder if it would be, I'm proposing this to the steering group, if Zoe and I merged these 2 concepts, the phases and the how we divided the work up, into something to propose back to the full commission in August. We still have time between August and September 15th to make sure that that makes sense to the full commission. I think it could go far if the steering group is okay with us taking a stab at drafting something back to it. We'll put it in the full commission packet so people can read it ahead of time. And whatever we offer as a draft, I think that's a pretty big step forward, I think. Knowing that we're about to turn our attention to the finance committee, that's almost a piece of it that's getting launched more immediately because of its initial piece. So steering group okay with us drafting? Jennifer?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would feel comfortable with delegating that to the 2 of you with my thanks.
Thanks. Okay, perfect. So Zoe and I will work on that. It will go back in front of the full commission. If it's okay with folks, we are a little ahead of time. Does anybody need a 5-minute turn your camera off and stand up and stretch, or do you want to power through? Okay. If I'm not hearing anything, then I'm gonna say, let's keep going. So finance subcommittee, this is actually a charge of the steering group. And I apologize in advance. I've been using committee and group interchangeably, and I should not. You are the steering group. But you are tasked with identifying a finance subcommittee to kick off the work. And we started with just some proposed criteria to say what are the basics of what's the makeup of this group. And I think we should start our conversation with that. And then I think we would need to bring ourselves also back to the conversation, Jennifer, that you raised. And the thing I would want the steering group to talk through is you are actually the ones who name people. So I don't know how you have the conversation without naming people. So those are the two things. Let me just run through the criteria part, since that is absent of name. And I'll just tell you what I heard from your conversation and from input from others. And then we should start with, does that cover it all? So pretty universally, folks thought somewhere between 6 and 8 members, so that it is a committee that can get work done. Big committees can be hard. Majority commission members to ensure the continuity of work and messaging. And then we started a list about call it expertise, call it perspective, roles, whatever you want to call it. But some proposed were needing a school business manager, a superintendent or district level leader, individuals with expertise in Vermont's funding system and Vermont's constitutional requirements for equity, as well as knowledge and understanding of other state models. That is a long list, and it reminds me, people can check more than one box, right? Like these don't necessarily all need to be a single person from each bullet. Someone who can represent the perspectives of the administration, a school board association representative, and then legislative or general assembly rep. That is the starting list for your criteria. So group can react to that, agree, disagree, add to, delete. What do folks think?
And
Nicole, and then Anne.
So I really like that composition. I think if we assume there's an individual that can meet all those, it's about 7 folks. I agree that it should be largely commission members. And I think that the balance, the opportunity that I see this commission providing is for folks at the local level, folks in the legislature, and folks in the administration to come around the table and work through options that might work. And I think this proposed composition achieves that. And so I think having, I think we said legislative representation. I would argue a member of the House and a member of the Senate, because I think they do not always align, and it'd be really important to ensure there's investment in the conversation in both bodies of the legislature.
Thanks. Anne, and then Peter?
yeah, I'd feel better if we did a member of the House or the Senate. I think, as I'm jotting notes, it looked like it was fairly heavy in, as they refer to, the education establishment that has a vested interest in the outcome. And I'd like to see people that can also speak for the taxpayers, the public, the folks that are financing this system. So I don't know if that's and I'm also looking at some political balance, because there's a broad range of opinion that we need to have represented. And I'm not sure how you do that. Usually we do 2 members and 1 from each party. but that tilts numbers. So, but I think it's important that there's a balance of points of view and opinion, so that no one can say, well, they, whoever they are, not me, did this.
Thanks, Anne. Peter, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with the size. I think when we start talking about political balance, if we're talking about parties or whatever, it gets really complicated because education is something that is more about, can often be more about geography, can be more about topography, be more about demographics. So we're not going to please everybody on a 7-person subcommittee. I was not necessarily originally enthusiastic about having legislative members on there. I think I've come around to thinking that we're ultimately the ones who are going to have to sell it to our colleagues, or at least explain it as well as possible. And I'm not putting myself up on this. I'm just saying that I can understand the need to have legislative folks there. You know, as I went through this, I think that we've got various people, and we can talk about names in executive session. I'm comfortable with that, but who can tick a lot of different boxes. The one thing that we did talk about previously that I didn't see on this list is someone, and I think this can be a Vermont someone, who's got a strong understanding about how systems work in other states. And sort of the pros and cons and all of that. You know, I think just to Senator Cummings' concern about, you know, balance and heavily vested with those with something at stake. You know, I guess I get that, and I also get the perception that creates, and I think that it's important to call that out, because, you know, really it's been a criticism from the beginning that it's the same people sitting around the same table talking about the same thing. We're at a different point in time. I think that all of these associations have at least said publicly or said to me they're ready to make hard decisions that may not necessarily be the same as they might have made 5 years ago. But I just sort of wanted to acknowledge that is a concern that I've also heard. But I think that we can make a well-balanced one here. I mean, the administration has a different perspective than perhaps the organizations. I think some of the outside people will have a different opinion. But I'm going on and don't really have a point here, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Jennifer.
Thank you. Peter, you made me smile. So when I think about the composition of this committee, I think it's really important to have a good balance of people who have a really good perspective of what life is like on the ground, right? So people who really understand the ins and outs of being in a school, running a school, you know, whatever that person is. But we want someone who has, you know, I always think about like the trees in the forest. So we want someone who's a tree. We want a few people who are trees. But I think it's also important to think about someone who has the view of the forest, and having that outside perspective, I think, would be helpful. Because I think we don't want to be too myopic in our focus, but we also don't want to be so far removed that whatever great ideas we're coming up with aren't going to be implementable by the people who are in charge of implementing them. So I think there needs to be kind of this striation balance. That's one thought. And then the other thing that I think is really important is we have many different kinds of education delivery systems within the state, right? I mean, like we have fully operational K-12. We've got a lot with, you know, high school choice. We've got schools that passed their budget the first time. We have school districts that still haven't passed a school budget, and everything in between. So I think it would be really important to get, you know, sort of this geographic diversity of perspective where we can have people who can say what has worked well in their district as well as what has not worked well in their district. But I think, we don't want to have everyone coming from the same part of the state with the same experiences. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. Peter, I'll let you go first, and then I have a question coming back to the criteria, but Peter, you go first.
Sorry, I just left my hand up. Apologies.
Sorry. Jennifer, I'm thinking of your forest for the trees comment and folks on the ground. Is there a category of individuals that you think isn't represented here on this bulleted list? And do you want to add it, or are you, the geographic piece I get, I think that's something that we would have to pay attention to when we think about the who, but is there a missing role? Because there's 6 roles and we said 6 to 8.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I've been taking notes since we started this conversation, and I'm now up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. So not necessarily, but I wonder, are we going to have the same perspective shared by a school business manager, by a superintendent, and by a VSBA representative? Or if we have, if those are different perspectives, could we even maximize that difference in perspective by saying, okay, we're going to have a superintendent from whatever part of the state, but if the superintendent's from one part of the state, we're going to make sure that we have a business manager from a different part of the state, just so that we make sure that we are getting we're casting our net as wide as we can cast it.
I think we'll also run into the steering group's desire that this be made up of the bulk of commission members for continuity of work. So that's just a thought that I'm having.
Well, and that's a good
too much of that.
Yeah, and I apologize for interrupting, but I think, to your point, if you look at everything that we've listed out, plus commission members, now we're talking about a much bigger committee. And I think many of the perspectives that have been flagged are not necessarily met by commission members. So just, maybe we can think about how to winnow this list down and really maximize the people that we put on there.
Nicole,
So
go
as the
ahead.
only representative of the field on this committee, I'll speak a little bit to that. So I think the associations have appointed representatives to serve on the commission that represent and are deeply connected to the membership of those associations. So if you have a superintendent representative, they were appointed by the VSA, and my understanding is, I'm a school board representative. We have a superintendent. We're all from different districts, from different parts of the state. And so I would argue that we could rely on the fact that the associations had made their appointments with that in mind, and would not recommend we go beyond the commission appointees to try to obtain input from the field, because the associations have already sort of done that work and have mechanisms in place for ensuring their members are connected to the work of the commission. And then, so I don't see this as being more folks. I saw this, I had a count of 7, but so I don't know where the 8th comes from on your list, Jennifer, but I think that the legislature can figure out whether it's their reps on the commission or not, or whether it should be somebody from a money committee as opposed to a House Education Committee. But I don't think we're talking about 7 people plus commission members. I was interpreting the 7 to be predominantly commission members, with perhaps the exception of an expert in finance that's listed in that list, and potentially a member of the legislature that's not on the commission. But that was how I was interpreting the list.
It just, if I may, to answer your question, that how I came up with 8 is I started with the 5 bullets that were already listed. And then if we add in a state senator, a state representative, and someone with a strong understanding of how systems work in other states. Those were the additional 3 that I got.
I thought the individual with expertise in Vermont's education funding, as well as understanding of other state models, captured that piece. So that's where it comes from.
Okay.
Zoe and then Anne.
Thanks. So this may be captured, but I just think given that this is really specific to education finance, I just want to make sure that we have strong financial acumen represented for everyone who's serving in this role, and then being thoughtful about the need for potentially someone who has an outside perspective, either to be participating in it or facilitating. I think these are really challenging conversations, and it can be quite helpful to have be a third party being objective and facilitating a discussion, and really kind of, this is an opportunity, I think, as Representative Conlon said, to challenge prior assumptions, to think outside of the box. And so I just want to make sure that we have the right composition on the committee to help us facilitate those discussions in a way that's going to be very productive.
Thanks, Zoe. Anne?
You're muted.
Anne, I think you're
Sandra.
muted.
Yes, I am, because my phone was ringing. My committee drafted the original legislation, and at that point, our thinking was we were looking at legislative members and a very fast-acting task force, given the pressure to do something about tax rates. And as part of the last minute negotiations, and to the best of my knowledge, there was never a face-to-face meeting. There, it was the last night of the session that this task force just got stuck into the commission, kind of as a sop to our consciences, but it wasn't ever sat down between all the parties and worked out. But the original vision was for a legislative task force, which gave us access to joint fiscal and to ledge council. We don't have that now. And, but it was really a much more focused concept. And I'm not sure where we go with it in this broader context. But, the timeline, everything says that we have a serious problem this year. And I don't think anyone expects it to go away or get any kind of better next year. But now that it's been lined up at the same time with everything else, it's going to be very challenging to make sure that whatever gets delivered in January is not going to throw a wrench into whatever gets delivered, or that it has to be undone in order to move other recommendations forward. It just is a very, sometimes sausage making doesn't work really well when it's done at the last minute and you've got more than one or two cooks throwing ingredients in. And I think this one's got some rough edges, and we're going to have to see what we can do to work it out. And make it so it can be a functional part of this commission as a whole. And I will say I was probably the lead person having a meltdown over this, and it was a way to make me shut up. And I'm here, I'm a team player, but I'm quite cognizant that this is there's some discord between this committee and how it was put in and how it was set up and with the rest of the commission. And the education committee did the work on the commission. That wasn't my committee's expertise. So I'm not sure how we work this out. I do know if we run into snags, we can always go back in January and ask for some amendments to the law. That would be pretty standard if we find that it doesn't work. But there will be significant pressure from people for us to have some kind of a solution to their tax bills next year. Just given the predictions with the cost of health insurance, I think we're going to be looking at another hefty increase, and angry populace, because your school boards are all elected. People that are very angry and don't feel that we're addressing their needs are not always the most constructive group to deal with. And that's an immediate need that people are looking at. So I'm not sure what to tell you. But yeah, we're
Thanks,
gonna have to come up with something.
Anne. Nicole?
Thanks. I think, so I'm not sure, it sounds, Anne, like that you're struggling with the proposed composition. So I'm interested in unpacking that a little bit more, because how I'm seeing it is 7 members, 3 representatives of the field with different hats in the budget development process, 2 members from the legislature and 1 member from the administration, and then there's the ed finance expert. In my view, it sounds like there's fear that having representation from the field will block conversations around changes. And I can't speak for the other associations, but I think I am participating in this process in good faith and in the hopes that we can have hard conversations, potentially facilitated conversations, but that having the perspective of folks who wear really important hats at the local level through the development of a budget is helpful, not only to sort of kick the tires on ideas and understand what's possible and what's not, but also to get information out to the field. I think Jeff Francis said in the initial meeting, like, if we're supposed to recommend cost containment provisions for the next session in December, the budget process is already well underway by that point. And what I have seen happen time and again in the legislative process is you get to January and it's too late. The budgets are pretty much done. And so I think that's another reason I think it's important to have folks from the field on this committee, because they're a conduit of information back out to the field. Hey, it looks like these are the 3 options. So plan accordingly as you're developing your budgets, to avoid the sort of constant conundrum of it's January, the budgets are done, there's nothing that can, or, you know, something happens and it's chaos, which we've seen.
As it was
also
this year.
Yes.
With the
Yeah.
whole 10% cap. And I
Yeah.
think that's may well be coloring the conversation. There was a lot of discussion in the House. I know there were some emails that went out that were pretty hard hitting. I've seen copies of one that went out to school boards. And so, yeah, I've got some concern if the majority of the people on the board are establishment, that we might it can be used to call into the question the lack of impartiality of the board. And I think we can work that with balance. But I think we need to make sure, and I think we need to have an uneven number. I've never set up a committee with an even number of people.
Yeah, I would just say 3 is not a majority of 7, so.
Well, I was getting everybody. So if it's just 3, then we're in good shape.
I think
I
the criteria
was
we
just
had
having
was a
trouble
school board
keeping
member, a
notes up.
superintendent, and a business manager, so
We've
3.
got business med, school board, and superintendents, 2 legislators, the administration
And an ed finance expert.
expert. Okay. Where we find that? Be interesting. Okay.
So that was actually going to be my suggestion, but then I'll run through the hands first, is to just reiterate, are we changing criteria? Because some of this discussion may be resolved when we talk about who potentially.
Yeah.
Zoe, and then Craig, and then Jennifer.
So I think what I'm hearing in terms of the composition is we do want people who are intimately involved in the budgeting process and have different perspectives. We want to make sure that we have legislative representatives, because the legislators are making the decisions around this ultimately. And then we have kind of administration's perspective, which I think is important, as well as what I'm hearing too is just this broader expertise around education, finance, and taxes, which I think is really critical to make sure we have that as part of the composition. I would also suggest that timing is important, and that there is a sense of urgency to establish this committee very quickly. I know that the governor will soon be releasing some information just around what we know right now, right? And encouraging everyone to continue engaging in this conversation very early. And Craig can kind of expand on what that looks like. But I think it's going to be really important that we also consider timing of getting people together quickly to begin to understand what we know now, based on current projections, and what can be considered in this short term as we're moving forward with this conversation. And maybe as part of the charge with appointing members is there's clarity around what input and perspective we need to bring to the table, to ensure that they are empowered and accountable also for engaging those perspectives. And should that need to be reevaluated through the steering committee later down the road, I think we should look at that to make sure that we truly are getting a diversity of perspective, but do also think it's important to get this composition kind of nailed down and get the group established now, with the assumption that we can revisit and potentially engage other expertise as we need moving down the planning. Craig, do you have anything from a tax perspective that you think we need to make sure we're weighing in on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Zoe had mentioned, right, I think the governor's looking to release some information soon about that I mean, we don't have all the data to do projections for tax rates for next year, but as Senator Cummings mentioned, right, we know some of the challenging pressures that we have, and so it's probably going to be a very difficult year again. And I also heard, I think, Jeff at the last full commission meeting saying it's important, and now Nicole here saying like it's important to get that information out early, so trying to do that. I think one of the things I don't know if concerned is the right word, and maybe I'm sort of uniquely positioned in having more expertise on one side of this equation than the other, and maybe the other members won't have the same kind of challenge. But as I look at a group of that size, and I'm very sensitive to larger groups maybe struggling more to make decisions, but it seems there are at least 2 major sides to the equation when you're talking about education finance, right? And one is sort of the local level budgeting process, right, that the folks in the field are driving, and that is still a construct of state government. But then there's the formula, right, which is more of a construct of state government that the field is operating within. And like, we've got to be talking about both of those, and those might not all be the same people, right? I even think about expertise within the administration. I have more expertise on the formula finance side, and Zoe and AOE have more expertise on the local budgeting side, right? And so I even think about having like one member from the administration, one member from these other places. Are we going to make sure that we've got enough coverage for both of those sides to be having effective conversations about both of those issues, which I think are going to be really important for the entirety of the finance discussion. And I say all of that without necessarily having a solution, which is the greatest way to present a challenge, but it's just something that's in my head and I'm wondering about.
Thanks, Craig. Jennifer, and then I'll try to revoice what I heard.
Well, and I just want to circle back that the person with the broader expertise may in fact be two people, because we want someone with expertise with Vermont's education funding system, but I think we would also really benefit from finding someone with expertise in other state funding systems, so that again we can look at what other states are doing that might be helpful to our situation. And I think it's, to me, it feels really critical to have that broader perspective, because what we've been doing right now, I think we can all agree we wouldn't be here if it were working the way we all wanted it to work. So we need to be doing something different. And I think we do need to have that broader perspective. So I'm not sure what that does to our numbers. I mean, that puts me up to 8. And to Anne's comment, I don't want this to be, I mean, if we stick with an odd number, I don't want this to get unwieldy. And I feel like maybe if we look at 7, but make sure that we have both of those education funding, you know, both well, not even local, statewide, and other states. I think all of those perspectives are important. Thanks.
So I don't know that I'm necessarily hearing changes to the list so much as makeup and making sure that we're touching on each of them, with one exception that maybe 2. So from the perspective of folks who build budgets and are involved with the programmatic side, that's the school business manager, superintendent, school board association. Expertise in Vermont funding as well as other states' perspective in terms of both funding and delivery, I heard, may or may not be one person. Once we start talking about names, we can talk about that, but that's either one person or 2. Representative of the administration, just hearing both you, Zoe, and Craig, maybe that is actually 2 people on both sides of the administration. So there's a potential of another person, but I don't know that it's another piece of criteria necessarily, is what I'm wondering. And I just wonder if we moved this to talking about who, if we might get faster toward the ideal number. That's just a proposal. And it will bring us to the conversation about how to have that. I would need someone to help me know why we would go into executive session to talk about names. So anyway, I don't want to take us there, but it feels like if we start talking about potential, because if we create an entire parallel committee that's not made up of commission members, then we're going to have a connect problem. And we just spent the first half of today's meeting talking about how important it is that these 2 things run hand in hand. So I think that would be really tricky. So it also feels like our first run through of names should be looking at commission members, and then what expertise doesn't exist on the commission. And then that is what should point the group to outside members. That's my sense. Anne, and then I think Jennifer, you put your hand up again. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, politics is nasty, but we're going back in January. There are people running for election. I can't tell you how many times in parades this summer people have yelled at me, "You raised my taxes." There will be legislation introduced. And if you only have one legislator on there or two, you're not going to have the momentum to perhaps curve or stop some things that could be very counter to where the commission is going. I mean, we've got a whole separate dynamic going on in the legislature that is going to write some things into law. We came pretty close this year to making changes. The pressure will be on, and I'm trying to get. I think we've got to be able to say to legislators, this is, you know, we're coming close. This is where we think the solution is going, and these are the steps you can take this year. But I've been there a long time, and I have never felt this kind of crisis pressure to fix it and fix it now. And so it's just a very different dynamic that's going on. And you've got to have at least two legislators, one in the House, one in the Senate, but they're going to have to be, I think, legislators that are respected, that are listened to. And an awful lot of those have retired, at least in the Senate.
So I just want to come back to, I still don't know that we have a numbers problem yet, but someone needs to tell me if I'm not right. So if we have a school business manager, a superintendent, an individual with expertise in funding, we have to ask ourselves if that's one or two people. So I'm acknowledging that, but assuming right now it's one, and we have two representatives from the administration, and we have a school board association representative, even if we have two, sorry, I'm making my hand go up, even if we have two legislative representatives, we're still at 8. And that is not an exorbitantly large group. It is an even number, although I would argue that this is the kind of group that's not going to want to be a split vote. So I am just not convinced yet, unless the 2 and from the legislature isn't enough. I'm not convinced yet we have a numbers problem. And so that's what makes me want to think about who populates that. Because it's true, if we decide that outside expertise doesn't sit in one person, then that might make 9. So that's just what I'm seeing. And then I know, Jennifer, you had your hand up, and then Peter.
Thank you. So actually, I now have 2 thoughts, and I'll go with the later one first. With regard to the fact that it would be helpful to have legislators who are respected and listened to, there's nothing that says that we need to only consider current legislators. I mean, I think we have the ability, and maybe that's a worthy discussion, as to whether there are people who have stepped off, who are no longer in the General Assembly, but might nevertheless have that institutional background that would really lend itself well to this group. So I just throw that out as a suggestion. And then the second thing was with regard to the executive session, since I'm the one that raised it. My thought was that if we were going to be discussing people by name, and we don't have, well, I've received emails from people expressing their interest who may or may not ultimately be selected, as I'm sure probably everyone else has as well. And at the same time, might be considering people that would be a good fit, but I've not spoken to them to see if they would be willing to serve on this committee. And it just, my only thought with the executive session is that if we're discussing people by name, it might be more thoughtful to not mention them publicly until we know that everyone is in favor of them and that they've agreed to serve. So that was my thought. Thanks.
Peter, did you you took your hand down. Did you want to go?
I took
or
my hand
Nicole?
down. I took my hand down.
Okay.
I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, Nicole?
So just as someone who trained school boards on the open meeting law, I think uncomfortable conversations are, uncomfortable, but we can only go into executive session if the law allows it for the specific topic. So the only one that I can see would be appointment of a public officer or employee. And I'm not sure that a member of a subcommittee constitutes a public officer under Vermont statute. So I appreciate the discomfort associated with naming names. I also think if where we're headed is predominantly folks on the commission, if folks have expressed a willingness to serve on the commission, it may not be a surprise to them if their name is thrown around. But I would be open to, I think what we need to talk about is this the appointment of a public officer? And if it's not, then we just need to proceed with having a conversation in public. And if it is, then let's make a motion. But I've never considered appointment of a committee member equivalent to appointment of a public officer, which tends to be something along the lines of a superintendent or, somebody who's hired to execute, positions on behalf of a board.
I was considering them a public officer, but that's, my interpretation.
Yeah. I don't know.
Oh, that's challenging. We've got two people with law degrees disagreeing here, so I don't know where we go from here.
Well, someone could make a motion to go into
It's open
executive
to
session. And it
interpretation,
could-
and someone can make a motion.
Correct, exactly. And then it would vote. I have one other offer of if we are starting with, is there a member of the commission who fits this criteria? If we start there and see who's left, it at least minimizes the non-commission names that have to be spoken to. But I should let you decide, group, if someone's going to make a motion about an executive session.
Well, maybe that is a fair way to sort of strike the balance here, because the commission members are clearly public with their experience and backgrounds that they bring to the commission. So I think that is a fair discussion to have in public. I think where I would feel less comfortable perhaps is talking about people who aren't on the commission who may or may not know that they're being discussed and may or may not then end up serving on the committee. So I would be comfortable with sort of doing a hybrid process here.
Anne?
I got sued for this once many years ago in local government because local government regularly you went in and discussed who you were going to appoint to the planning commission. This one was the building inspector commission. It got thrown out, but there is a question there. But yeah, somebody may not know they're being, and to me, it stifles discussion if I can't say, this guy is so opinionated, he really isn't conducive to a public discussion process, because I'm not comfortable saying that in public. And I guess this is where we're hurting not being a legislative committee, because we don't have a lawyer sitting in the room, or a hired lawyer sitting in the room with us. So it does make it hard to know what to do. But I didn't go to jail.
Zoe, go ahead.
So I'll suggest something that it may slow us down, so that and alone may have us not go that direction. But I think there's an opportunity to identify within the commission who has this expertise that can serve, and then identifying where we're looking to fill the gap. And potentially that could be a process where we ask for people to express an interest, and then we're working from a pool of people who have already submitted an interest and thrown their hat in the ring to review, and we could have that public discussion.
I think, go ahead.
Well, and I'm wondering too, since we are by statute we're relying on the assistance of the agency. I don't know, Zoe, if you might want to reach out to AOE council and ask them to opine on this question.
One moment.
Zoe, while you do that, do we start with the first part of your suggestion, which is just start at the top of the list? Does this exist on the commission? And there's some that I think.
I think it's also helpful to sort of maybe talk through a little bit, as I think to Craig's point, like the different hats or the different types of expertise that someone, just because they're sitting in a particular, wearing a particular hat, you know, to the extent any of us can speak to that, that might be helpful in terms of narrowing the specific criteria we want for anyone who's not on the commission.
Okay, I'm just going to start at the top of our list. School business manager. We do have a school business manager on the commission, Elizabeth Jennings. We have a do you want me just to keep going? Let me keep going. Superintendent, we have a superintendent on the commission, Mike Licklider. Individual with expertise, there's a lot in this bullet. Individual with expertise in Vermont's education funding system, as well as other states' funding systems and Vermont's commitment and constitutional requirements for equity. Nicole.
Yeah, appreciate the fact that we're just zipping through the names, but I did want to just name, like, Elizabeth Jennings is a business manager in Addison County, has number of very small rural districts within her district. And so that's, I think, just, and as part of the leadership structure for VASBO. And Michael Licklider is a recent move to Vermont superintendency, and he had previously served in Pennsylvania, so he has some familiarity with how another state funds education for better or worse. I think it's important to put that stuff on the table as we're thinking through the composition.
Thank you,
I'm
Nicola.
sure if either one of them were here, they could add more that they can contribute, but that's what I know.
Thanks. That's really helpful, even just geographic representation, different structures, district versus supervisory union. And
Mike Licklider is a superintendent in Harwood, which is another central Vermont located, but rural, small schools, larger schools, etc. Capital needs, you name it.
Former gold towns.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets that whole yin and yang of pre-Act 60, which has come up.
Yep. So expertise in funding and equity and other states. I think right now it's just, yeah, does it exist in the commission? I think is our.
That's what we hire out staff. I mean, there's people in the joint fiscal office. There are some of the authors of Act 60 might still be around, but I don't know that anybody is interested. If they're listening, maybe they could let us know. But I can't think of.
Megan, getting back to your original question of whether this expertise exists on the commission.
Correct.
I mean, I would say yes, maybe up into the point of a broad understanding of other states and their area. Obviously, a lot of people have a lot of these skills. that may be just the one that where we might bring in some outside help.
Yep. Thanks, Peter. And I think, and to your point, I think several people probably have suggested names. We're holding on that until we have maybe a little more clarity about how we're going to have that conversation. Craig.
Yeah, and I think sort of to echo Rep. Conlon's point, I think there's a lot of varying degrees of expertise on the Vermont system. I also just wonder if there is some value. I've heard folks talk about it can be a volatile discussion, it can be a political discussion, right? That if we have sort of a neutral outside person who's trying to help facilitate that part of the discussion, it might be helpful as well. And I guess what I'm also realizing, I'm sort of dipping back into the prior discussion we had, but I think I'm also wondering about the requirement for that person to be an actual member of the committee versus just the committee having access to resources and supports that have that expertise. And I don't know, maybe it really is critically important that it's a member of the committee itself and not support that's available, but it also might suffice to be support available. I don't know.
I think it's a good question for the group to. That is a distinction. And what are the pros and cons to committee membership versus consultant, besides the obvious, the process through which you would have to go through to get that as a consultant. Anne?
Yeah, as I said, that's something I hire my staff. I asked joint fiscal, I asked the lawyers, what does the law say? What do the numbers say? Because they are nonpartisan, they are presenting me with data. If you represent a particular group, it doesn't have that same feel as being just just information. And I'm reading that. I would think that's something you get from a consultant. I don't think we're going to find anyone that's going to volunteer here that is an expert both in Vermont's system and in other states' systems. I know the state has worked with a consultant in the past, as late as this year, that probably has a fairly good understanding of our system, but definitely has an understanding of other states, which is why we've hired him. But that may be a consultant when we get to that point that you look at. But I know I can't think of anyone that has.
So let's come back to this one.
Yeah.
Let's come back to this one. The next kind of bullet is representative of the administration. Oh, and then I saw Zoe's hand, which might actually mean you have an answer for us. Did I miss that?
I was just going to call it, I think, experience working in another state and education systems is different than having expertise in education finance and policy. So I just think we need to make those distinctions. And I think that's why a consultant that is hired for that specific expertise could be quite valuable.
Do too.
Thanks. Okay. Representative of the administration or representatives, given how the conversation went. I don't know. Craig and Zoe, you're the two on this group. I don't know if you want to weigh in.
I think it would be us.
Yeah, I think as Craig had said, we both of our agencies have access to subject matter experts within the organization that we can bring into the conversation, so that we bring in all of those perspectives, bring in the different data, and we would help to ensure that the right people are in those meetings to answer those specific questions as needed.
Thanks. Peter?
Thanks. I worry we only have Craig and Zoe from the administration. We've got other committees to populate, and so I am wondering whether having both of you on this versus one, under the understanding that the administration sort of speaks with one voice, do we need to have you both on this? And then I worry about your ability, especially Zoe's ability to be available to the other committees that are more dealing with policy than with finance. I throw that out there. I guess I'm not sure that having the two members of the administration on the commission devoted to one committee is a prudent use of their time.
I like to say I like to be everywhere, but I'm realizing that's not always possible, right?
Appreciate the effort.
Well, I think whatever the decision, Craig and I will commit to working very closely together to make sure we're bringing forward the information that's needed. We work very closely together.
Yeah, I appreciate that sensitivity, Rep. Kylan. I certainly think Zoe is more valuable on the other subcommittees than I am, given where my expertise lies versus hers. But sensitive to that.
Yeah, so I can just with this conversation, I'll make sure I can remove myself from this consideration to be able to sit on other committees and just commit to working very closely with Craig and the AOE staff and providing some additional information to help inform the discussion, if that's the direction the steering committee would like to go.
Okay. Jennifer and then Nicole.
Sure, thank you. And Peter, thank you for your sensitivity in flagging that as an issue. I had understood earlier, maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago when we were talking about the different perspectives, and Craig was commenting that, his expertise really lies more with tax formula, and that, Zoe's expertise is really more implementing it at the district level, and really the relationship between the agency and the districts. So I don't know if these are two overlapping perspectives or if these really are two separate things that we are looking to have representation in this committee. I can't answer that question, but I didn't sound to me earlier like they were, basically offering the same perspective when we were talking about it.
I mean, if I'm sitting there alone, I can say for sure I'm not going to bring the same level of expertise about how to execute that in the field that Zoe. And maybe others.
So I was just going to say, I think we had talked earlier about the possibility of Nicole Lee and Julia Richter providing support, I would say in particular support to this group. And I know Nicole, based on her position within the agency, is that sort of direct link to the field. So I don't know that Nicole would be a member of the committee, but she could be potentially accessible by the committee in terms of understanding some of those dynamics again, so that if Zoe needs to be brought into a conversation, at least there's somebody from the agency sort of in the room listening to the discussion. So that's just one thought I had about the staff piece that Anne was talking about. I mean, we will need to be asking for data and information relative to school budgets and ed finance, and I would assume that Julia and Nicole would be the staff who had access to that information, but I don't want to assume that. We were on to the last piece, the last role, and I can, if it's helpful, just speak a little to, I'm the school board rep, but I've worn a lot of different hats, so I can just share that I've been an attorney who focuses on ed finance law. And so I have very technical knowledge of our funding system, both from a policy perspective, but also as it's implemented. I served 3 years as a school business manager. And so I do have that sort of connection between the formula itself and how it plays out in terms of the budgeting process. And so just wanted to offer that as another person who can be at the table, who can make that connection between the formula and the budgeting process.
Thanks, Nicole.
I'm gonna have to go for a minute. I have an alarm going off and I have workmen working here, so I need to go see what's happening.
Good luck,
I'll be
Ann.
back momentarily.
Jennifer.
Thank you. All right, I have two thoughts. One, back on Zoe. I might suggest that we leave it to Zoe to decide whether or not she feels like she can serve on this committee. But the one other thing, Zoe, that I think you would bring is you have worked in other states. Not sure how analogous those states are to Vermont necessarily, but I think you know, you do have experience and exposure to other ways of thinking about the problems that I think are plaguing us. So I just wanted to mention that. And then Nicole, I'm wondering if you could serve both hats, both as the school board association representative as well as the school business manager box that we had identified earlier, since you've also served in that capacity.
I would not feel comfortable representing both of those perspectives at this point because I'm a couple years out, and actually I think Elizabeth's was, but that was a temporary gig for me. Elizabeth's been doing it a long time and is, again, like I said, a leader in the business officials organization and has that conduit to those folks on the field who really, I think, are critical stakeholders. So appreciate the thought, but that would not be a place I'd feel particularly comfortable.
Thanks. Zoe?
I'm just going to respond to Jennifer. So I do have experience working in 7 different states. And so I think that's where the kind of the conversation around how it, implementation of different funding models impacts what you can do in terms of prioritization, and also experience doing strategic based budgeting for systems. I want to call out, though, I think that's very separate than someone who has coming in as a consultant with experience with education finance, right? So I do think I bring that perspective of kind of the implementation piece of it, but do think that there's value in bringing someone else in who really is deeper in kind of the education finance and doing some of the modeling of what these different scenarios might need to look at. So I just call that out. And then the other piece I would say is that I did get input from Emily Simmons from our legal counsel regarding the question of executive session. And what she indicated is we can go to executive session, but we would have to come out of executive session to actually vote on the particular names. Yeah. So if you wanted to do that, let me see if she gave us language on what the motion would be. Yes, so just that we could enter session to discuss, but we'd have to come out to vote in public. So if you want to entertain that as an option, that is available to us.
Should I run through who we have so far? Because I think we've gotten through the commission members and now we are going to need to talk about other names. So, and I know you haven't finalized this, but we have a committee member for school business manager, superintendent, representation from the administration, whether that's one or both, but it's on the, you are commission members, school board association representative, and potentially legislative, if it is either or both. Peter and Ann may also be someone outside of the commission. So that leaves the individual with expertise in funding. There's also the conversation about whether that's a consultant or a commission member. But that requires talking about names. And actually, if the legislative General Assembly rep is not Ann or Peter, then that requires talking about names. Does someone want to make a motion?
Yep, I appreciate that list, and given the response from legal counsel, I would make a motion that we go into executive session for the purpose of discussing, but not voting on, the other appointments to the finance subcommittee.
Jennifer?
I will second, but I also note that we don't have a link for an executive session.
If you give me 1 minute, I can have a link for you.
Thank you. Maureen, always there to save the day.
Zoe, go ahead, and then I'll ask for a vote on going into executive session. Zoe?
I was just gonna clarify a couple pieces in terms of the language for the motion, just to make sure we indicate that it's to consider the appointment of a public officer who will serve on the finance committee pursuant to 1 VSA 313A3. If this motion is passed, no formal action to appoint will be taken in executive session. The final decision to appoint or not appoint will be made in the open meeting, with reasons for the steering committee's final decision made during the open meeting.
As the maker of the motion, that's what I meant to say. Thank you.
No, I knew that.
And Jennifer, you meant to second that, right?
Indeed, I did.
Yes, that will be in the minutes. Perfect.
All those in favor of going into executive session when we have a link?
Aye.
Since it appears we are all in favor, I won't do a roll call. Any opposed?
And just for the clarification for the folks here, I guess I would say two things. One, if we're going to go into executive session now, let them know that we will return. I might also suggest that if folks are here to make public comment, would we like to move that up in the agenda before we go into executive session? So they aren't made to wait for us.
That is, we can do, that's a great suggestion. We do also have 2 other agenda items that are quicker. So we can pause and have a public comment now. Why don't we just do that? For those that might have to leave, we can always have another public comment at the very, very end.
Did she freeze for everybody?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I think if there are any members of the public, they can raise their hand if they wish to be heard, or if they're calling in, press *5 on your phone.
Megan, we lost you for a little bit, and Jennifer took over and has started public comment, which is very helpful.
Thank you. I could actually hear you all, but you couldn't hear me. Thank you. I do see a hand. John Clifford.
And I can't hear John. Is it *6 to unmute, I believe?
John, are you able to share? I thought I saw you unmute.
Should we maybe go back to him? Because I think I saw another hand raised.
That sounds good. And since Megan has completely disappeared, perhaps Jennifer, why don't you go ahead and continue?
Well, thanks. I saw someone else had their hand raised, and now I don't see her.
I see a hand for Margaret McLean.
Okay, thank you. I can't see her, but yes, Margaret, that was who I saw. Margaret, I think if you're able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Margaret McLean. just as a brief introduction, I was previously the executive director of Vermont Rural Education Collaborative and an employee of the Rural School and Community Trust, a national advocacy organization for rural schools. I was also a member of the Vermont State Board of Education. So I appreciated Nicole's call to look at strengths and values. And from my experience in Vermont, which is extensive, I can say that Vermonters see as a strength and a value three things that I'm going to mention briefly. The first is community schools, be those full service community schools or schools embedded in communities, particularly for the youngest children. So those schools might be pre-K to 2, pre-K to 4, pre-K to 6, pre-K to 8. And historically, they've been created that way based on if they are in public school systems with union high schools, as opposed to if they are a town or community that operates for some grades and tuitions for others. So there's obviously more flexibility in schools that are public schools, pre-K through 12, that operate at those levels than there are in those that do not operate at all grade levels. But Vermonters see and value the fact that they can have community schools that they can interact with. The second thing Vermonters, particularly rural Vermonters, see as a strength and a value is the convenient education of youth. Convenience, the word used in the Vermont Constitution. And for rural children, convenience is an equity issue. Long bus rides make for inevitable environments for children who travel long distances. The states have plenty of evidence, particularly West Virginia, on this topic. An example that's about to hit Vermont is the example in Roxbury. Roxbury was a voluntary merger with Montpelier. The school board closed the Roxbury School this spring due to financial pressure. This fall, Roxbury children will be traveling to Montpelier. Roxbury and Montpelier are not contiguous. From the Roxbury School to the Montpelier School is approximately 35 minutes in a car. I'm not sure how long in a school bus, but Roxbury is a town of 46 square miles and low population density. So by the time a school bus winds its way around those dirt roads of Roxbury's 46 square miles and picks up children and then drives to Montpelier, you will have 5- and 6-year-olds arriving at the Montpelier school who have been on a bus a minimum of an hour, potentially much longer. And when you do that twice a day, it impacts your ability to engage in the education at the school that's offered because you're exhausted, you're tired, you can't function the way a kid who's walked across the street to the school can function or been dropped off in a car. So the convenient education of youth, particularly for rural children, is a very important issue for the Commission to consider. The third issue is Vermont has valued democratic engagement in their schools, and they have a long history of democratic engagement through electing local school board members, through town meeting. Back in 2014, Marty Strange from Randolph, the policy director of the Rural School and Community Trust, testified to the State House about how in other states, as governance becomes more distant, regionalized, that there is increasing lack of support for public education. This spring, we saw a disparity between districts with centralized governance as opposed to town school districts in terms of supportive budgets. Districts where governance is more removed from a local setting have had a much harder time passing budgets than local school budgets. So something to think about, how Vermonters who are skilled at practice in local democracy, now that's changed, how that then reflects on public support for public education. So those are my three things. My fourth recommendation is that you consider either Jack Hoffman or recently retired Paul Silo from the Public Assets Institute. They have a long history of knowledge about school finance in Vermont, and either of them would be viable experts to be on the Finance Committee. Please consider an appointee from Public Assets Institute to that group. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I think we have one other person with their hand up who is on a phone. Go ahead.
*6 to unmute.
Oh, good. Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hi, this is Mary Gannon. Sorry, I'm on a phone and not used to the technology of this, doing it this way. My name's Mary Gannon. I have been following the meeting so far, and I think I spoke at the last commission meeting also. I am a educational equity coach, strategy consultant who works across the state and a lot of different districts. Just a couple quick comments, because I don't want to take up a lot of airtime. I am still concerned about how the issue of diverse representation is being addressed between the commission and the steering group. So I will keep raising this issue, and I have actually reached out to a couple of you individually about that concern. It seems to be, I'm not sure where people are with that attention to that, but it's at the beginning of the statute that it's not just around geographic representation, but there are other diverse representations as well, which at this point, I'm not sure are being fully included as voices at the table or part of the work that you're doing. So I will continue to push for that, and I hope that that will get addressed because I think it's so important. The second thing I want to say is I heard a conversation earlier that I continue to hear in the context of education across the state around multiple definitions of educational equity, or what does equity mean? I think Ann Cummings was bringing that up, and others, and I appreciate that it is such an important conversation to have. And what I think I also said at the first commission meeting, and I will say it again at the risk of being of repeating myself, I would encourage you all to take a few minutes and actually decide what your definition is of equity. What is educational equity with all the different buckets, as you're calling them, of work that you have to do? And once you come up with your framework, your equity lens, so to speak, or your equity paradigm, and I think I heard Interim Secretary Saunders speak to this, that will help you in ensuring that you are giving all the different parts of your work the attention around equity that it needs. But if you continue to talk about equity as an extra bucket, or an additional detail that needs attention instead of centering it, I worry, and I think it's a fear for many of us that we will continue to create the same challenges and dilemmas that we are trying to work our way out of. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Alan Gilbert, I think, is our last hand.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I have 4 observations after listening to today's meeting, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan Gilbert. I live in Worcester. I've been a journalist, a teacher, a writer, and an ACLU executive director. I'm also the former chair of the Worcester School Board and the Washington Central Supervisory Union Board. I'm a former president of the Vermont School Boards Association and I was active in the Brigham case. The four observations I have, the first one is that I think it's very important to know what costs have been shifted over the last 25 years from the state's general fund to the education fund. The ones that come to my mind are first, elimination of school construction grants, changes to the funding of the education pension fund, the total cost of incentives in Act 46 to encourage district consolidation. I believe there are a number of other costs, student meals, expanded mental health services. The sum of these shifts is, I believe, quite substantial, and it's one of the major problems we're having right now. My second one is something that's come up repeatedly today, and that's this. I think it's very important that people understand what equity means in regards to the Brigham decision. It means equal access to school funds across the state. $1 on the property tax in one town raises the same amount of money as $1 on the property tax in all other towns. That's necessary in order to meet the common benefit mandate in Article 7 of the Vermont Constitution, which was really the legal linchpin of the Brigham argument. It's not that all children must have exactly the same education opportunities. It's that their district must have the same opportunity as all other districts to provide the opportunities that are required and the opportunities that the district feels are important to its students. Number three is, I believe a lot of people would appreciate an explanation of why required reports of Act 46, such as how much consolidation of districts saved, they've never been done. And I consistently hear people saying, why don't we have the reports of how consolidation has worked so far? Finally, I would humbly suggest to try to use less jargon in your meetings that are open to the public, because I think it's really hard for people to understand what's being said. People in the education field are well known in having their own manner of speaking. I have a master's degree in education myself, so I know about this, and it really can be a bit off-putting. I would urge you to try and be as simple as you possibly can when you're meeting with the public, because it means a lot to be able to understand what people are saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So I did see that Maureen sent a link. I actually need to rely on my colleagues to know mechanically how you tend to do this. I'm assuming Jennifer, State Board, does this frequently. Why don't you explain to us what we should do?
Thank you. It's funny, like where I sort of click and I'm like, oh yeah, yeah. So we all need to leave this meeting. And I mean, don't just pause this meeting, but you physically need to hang up and leave this meeting and then go to your email and click on the link that Maureen just sent to you.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then after we finish our executive session, we will come back into this meeting and wrap up where we are.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Make sure we have everyone back. I think so. Can I have a motion coming out of executive session?
Okay. I'm here.
Nicole,
I move that the steering committee appoint Elizabeth Jennings, Michael Likelighter, Craig Bolio or designee, Zoe Saunders or designee, Senator Ann Cummings, Representative Emily Kornheiser, and Nicole Mace to the Education and Finance Subcommittee. Is that okay if I nominate myself?
I think so.
Didn't think that one through.
Can I have a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, Craig. Discussion? I would just say, to add context, there's a recognition that Finance Committee will need to engage with various perspectives and expertise. And not all of those perspectives can commit to an 18-month term on a subcommittee. And so it's committed to also identifying where that needs to be brought in. Okay. There's no other discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, so the motion carries. I'm going to move very quickly into our next two agenda items, recognizing we're really far past our end time. I think they can be quick. One is, I'll start it as an acknowledgement unless steering group members have anything to add to it. We just acknowledged at our last meeting that we need some kind of structure to report back the work of the steering group to the full commission. We'll also have to figure out communication loops as we think about it, doing our work in subcommittees. Recommendation for now is that there be a standing committee report agenda item at full commission meetings. At minimum, at our next commission meeting, the steering group will report out because that's the only group who has reported so far. That will give the opportunity for the full commission to ask questions, to potentially ask for something to be put more formally on an agenda, and things like that. So at minimum for our next meeting, that's what I'm proposing, as long as that works for the steering group. Okay. And then speaking of, our agency folks did gather some information for us about scheduling our next meeting. And ideally we would have had some conversation about our cadence as a steering group, adjoining those meetings. For now, given the time, the date that from the scheduling poll that worked for all all full commission members is Monday, August 26th, the morning time. So 9 to 12 on Monday, the 26th. So I think we're going to confirm that as the next full commission meeting date. There is also some scheduling information about future meetings and which Monday of the month. So rather than try to go through that now, I think that we can confirm our meeting dates when we meet. That's 3 weeks from now.
Everything's frozen.
You're back, Meg.
We lost you,
Okay,
Meg.
sorry.
You're back.
I don't know where you lost me, but clearly the internet is telling me this meeting is over. Are we okay to have full commission meeting on the 26th?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think Zoe and I are going to merge two concepts on a draft work plan, and it will go to the commission as a draft for them to discuss. And that should put us well in alignment for our September timeline. So agenda wise, I think I'm freezing again, maybe I'm not. We will have a data review. So we'll have probably a significant amount of data to be shared with the full commission, which I think will be really helpful in grounding our work. We'll bring a draft work plan and we will discuss our meeting schedule. Those are the three for sure agenda items.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. Is there any other, we realize we are past time, but are there any other members of the public who would like to make a comment before we sign off? Okay, I do not see any hands. I have not
don't
seen
know
it.
if you,
Oh, there's
can you
one.
hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. I would like to see more educators represented all the way down the line. Now, I realize you've just appointed people to one of the commissions. I didn't
Excuse
hear.
me, I don't mean to interrupt, but we haven't, if you would just wouldn't mind fully introducing yourself before giving public comment. That'd be
Sorry.
really helpful. Thank you very much. I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah.
Just wanted to
Yeah,
have
no,
a
my
record.
apologies. Dan MacArthur, School Board Chair in Marlboro, also a member of the board of the Vermont School Boards Association. And I would like to see, I'd just like you folks to remember that I would like to see more educators involved all the way along the line. So as you look at appointing these subcommittees, et cetera, try to get some teachers or principals or whatever in there. So it's not a criticism, it's just a comment. So thank you very much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Anyone else? Also scanning to see unmuting. Okay. I believe we are adjourned at 4:45. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for going long.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Sure.